we have Lina Teckentrup. So she's a recognised researcher at Barcelona Supercomputer Centre, and she's also a co-lead of our Fresh Eyes on CMIP documentation subgroup. So today she's talking about uncertainty in the carbon cycle response to projected climate change in Australia. So over to you, Lina.
Okay, cool. I'll try to share my screen. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. And as Eleanor said, I'm talking about the terrestrial carbon cycle in Australia, and obviously this is work I didn't do alone. I worked a lot on this with Martin DeCal, Andy Pittman, Anna Okola, David Woolen, and Benjamin Smith. And before I dive into all the fascinating details of my talk today, I want to give a bit of a motivation. So usually when we think of Australia, we don't necessarily think of it as a major contributor to the global carbon cycle, at least not on land. We usually associate Australia with barren desert, with like funny animals maybe, and Vegemite. So yeah, why did I actually want to look at this? So as I said, we were aware at the time already that Australia is not really a major contributor to the global mean carbon sink, which is thought to be mostly in the tropics and the boreal areas. But what we do know is that Australia is actually a really strong driver for the continued variability in the net land carbon sink anomaly, which is, for example, highlighted in the 2011 La Nina, where Australia contributed something like 40 to 60% to the global net carbon sink anomaly. Because of massive vegetation growth due to increased water availability. And another point is that understanding any part of the carbon cycle is really crucial for well, policy in terms of national carbon budget planning. So understanding the terrestrial carbon cycle is actually also really important in terms of policy making to some degree. And then the focus on Australia also came kind of naturally because I did my PhD in Australia. So that was also a major motivation, I guess. But anyway, so in order to understand the terrestrial carbon cycle, we basically focused on two different areas before we actually tackled the question of future projections. And the first one was to like kind of understand how terrestrial biosphere models, which is basically an umbrella term for anything that can simulate land carbon, so land surface models, dynamic global vegetation models and such, how they simulate the terrestrial carbon cycle of Australia, which is often really overlooked in global simulations. So what we did is we took the Chenyo ensemble. For those of you who don't know it, it's part of the global carbon budget, where basically a suite of terrestrial biosphere models are forced with the same historical forcing. So for the climate, for land use change, nitrogen deposition, and also things like population densities, etc. And we cut out Australia and looked at a couple of key carbon variables. And the first one that we looked at was the net biome productivity, which is basically the uptake between the balance between the carbon uptake and the carbon loss through respiration and disturbance. And positive values on this scale mean that Australia was in the historical period a carbon sink, and negative means it was a carbon source, so it actually released carbon to the atmosphere. The solid green line is the ensemble mean over the Chenyo ensemble, and the shaded green area is actually what's the most interesting part in this figure is the model spread across the Chenyo ensemble. And what's so interesting about this is, well, we already know that the net biome productivity is really variable on interlinear timescales. But when we look at individual years, the magnitude of the simulated sink or source is really quite model dependent, although they were all forced with the same forcing to a degree that the models don't even agree on sign. So in some years, some models might simulate that Australia was a carbon sink or a source, and obviously it would be quite desirable that they at least agree on the sign. However, we kind of figured that it is really complicated to simulate variability and especially the net carbon balance. So we wanted to look at whether maybe, hopefully, these kind of differences would cancel out if you look at the cumulative net biome productivity. So that's what we did, and then we found actually it does not cancel out. So when we sum up the NBP over the historical period, so unfortunately the time axis is cropped here, we can see that the different models, most of them actually simulate a net carbon sink for Australia over the historical period, which are these positive lines, but the magnitude actually really varies quite strongly depending on the model that is used. But we also have two models that simulate a carbon source. So actually over the historical period for these two models, Australia was a source and was constantly pretty much releasing carbon from land to the atmosphere. So there seems to be quite a lot of uncertainty in these models. And the last variable that I want to highlight here is also how much carbon is stored in vegetation in these kind of models for Australia. And this is a really good indicator for like the type of vegetation that is simulated. So what we found is that there's also a really large spread between 2 to 18 petagrams of carbon. So like a 9-fold difference between the lowest and the highest model, which is quite significant. And this is a good indicator for vegetation cover, because probably if you have really low vegetation carbon, this model is likely to simulate a lot of grass and desert vegetation, but the higher models on the higher end are probably simulating more tree vegetation, which then also would store more carbon in general. And this is important because if you have different vegetation covers simulated by the models, then all the carbon variables and the water variables that are simulated on top of it will probably vary quite strongly. Yeah, so like the 3 key points that we then found that are probably contributing to this uncertainty across the different terrestrial biosphere models is first that well, we have really different representation of the vegetation, and this can be in part due to the fact that we look at the global model and the vegetation types are really broad, and they might not be able to represent actually the really specific vegetation that is actually happening in Australia, because it's basically just a ginormous island in the middle of nowhere. So the vegetation is super endemic and specific, and it's probably not very comparable to that we find in Northern Europe or North America, for example. Other areas of uncertainty are that at this point, I think most models account for nitrogen limitation on vegetation productivity, so the nutrient cycling. But Australia is thought to be more phosphorus limited, and most models, at least in this training version, didn't have a phosphorus cycle in it. So an important constraint on the vegetation productivity and vegetation carbon storage is still missing in these kind of models, and might actually reduce the spread quite a lot. And then the third point is that also key vegetation process in Australia is fire, but not all of the models actually include dynamic fire representation. And the models that do have a fire model in it have quite varying complexity and scale in the fire simulated for Australia. So yeah, these are probably all reasons that lead to quite a lot of uncertainty across the different biosphere models. And once we found this out, the other thing that we wanted to look at was the impact of climate projections on simulated carbon. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly run through this figure. So we basically took the historical CMIP simulations for Australia and first looked at how the 30-year average for continental scale precipitation and temperature looked like, and also compared it to a reanalysis product that is often used to drive impact models, CRU-JRR. And what we first found is that the precipitation over the historical periods varies really strongly, where the driest models, I think, around 250 millimeters, and the wettest one could be like 800 millimeters. And that's a really large spread for a water limited environment. And obviously, if we run the terrestrial biosphere model with really dry climate, then we probably get less carbon and also less productivity. And we also looked at the temperature, which is here in the middle, where we think we should have a bit more scale, but there also the difference between the hottest and the coldest model was, I think, around 1 degree, which is roughly the historical warming that Australia experienced. And obviously, I know that often you kind of want to look at the changes, especially in temperature, rather than the raw absolute values, but these data directly go into the model. So biases in the absolute values are then also really reflected in what comes out in the carbon variables. And this is then what we saw when we looked at the total ecosystem carbon in the bottom, where we found that the spread in ecosystem carbon, just based on the biases in the Earth system model, is quite comparable to that we get when we look at the uncertainty linked to terrestrial biosphere models. So the spread in general is really quite large, and we then looked at different ways to correct the bias with different complexity and comparing univariate with multivariate approaches. But basically found if you want to look at 30-year averages or something for carbon pools, as long as you correct your data somehow, you're going to sufficiently reduce your bias with very similar value ranges, and you see a really strong impact on the ensemble uncertainty, which we here expressed in the coefficient of variation, where you get high uncertainty for the raw data, and it's usually, I don't know, a bit more than, we're roughly halved when we correct the data. So what we then did is we took a single terrestrial biosphere model, LPJS, and then I adjusted the vegetation types with plant traits in Australia to reflect the very unique vegetation. And we then ran it with different climate projections. And we also looked at coupled carbon cycle enabled CMIP simulations, and then tried to, I don't know, give a broad overview of like, yeah, what the carbon is doing in the future. So here I show a couple of different variables, but we're just going to focus on the calm stone vegetation because otherwise I'll be talking an hour still. In the top row is basically when I took the Australianized terrestrial biosphere model LPJS, and in the bottom is the carbon cycle enabled CMIP 6 models. And there's a couple of different things I want to highlight here. So the first thing is the blue, really large spread and bright blue, which in the top row is LPJS forced with the raw CMIP 6 simulations for SSP 245. And in the bottom is the spread and calm stone vegetation and the coupled CMIP 6 simulations also based on 245. And the spread is actually really quite similar in magnitude, highlighting the importance of climate biases in the projections on any time of carbon pools. When we look at the solid black line, which is ensemble median, we see that in both simulations, the carbon stone vegetation tends to increase until the end of the century with relatively similar values. And the third thing then is that I applied a trend preserving quantile mapping approach to the climate forcing before running it through LPJS. And then we can see that the uncertainties actually reduced quite strongly from, I think, well, 9 to 49 petagrams of carbon to 6 to 18. So it's a really, really significant reduction. And the dotted line here is ensemble median for the bias corrected ensemble. And we see that's actually quite similar to that of the raw ensemble. And this is quite expected. The last thing I want to highlight is that then also I did what everyone does in vegetation model. I did the favorite exercise of switching off the CO2 concentration being transient. So I always set to constant, but I kept the climate transient. So we still have changes in precipitation, increase in temperature. And while when all forcings are transient, we see an increase in calm stone vegetation until the end of the century. When CO2 is switched off and set to constant, actually we see a decrease. So the impact of the changing climate itself without the positive effect of CO2 fertilization is actually negative on calm stone vegetation. And I want to unpack this a little bit more. And we did a regional approach here. So I'm here just briefly showing a map for everyone to like get a sense of where the different ecoregions in Australia sit, where we have tropics in the north and then temperate areas here in the southeast, the savanna, which is basically a mix of trees, shrubs, and grasses, and then a large blob of desert in the middle, and then Mediterranean vegetation in the southwest and in the south of Australia. And what I wanted to look at was the spatial and the temporal effect of precipitation, temperature, and CO2 for those different regions, and also for Australia as a whole. These correlation, so basically this is just a distribution of the partial correlation, and with the partial correlation, I try to account for the interactions between precipitation, temperature, and CO2. And the different colors, this is are in dark blue when LPJS is forced with raw CMIP 6 forcing, and then in teals when I forced it with corrected forcing, and in orange is the coupled CMIP 6 simulations. For Australia and the first group, and then for the different ecoregions following up on this. And this is basically the effect of these drivers on the calm stone vegetation in the SSP 245 scenario. So the first thing that I think isn't really surprising is the spatial effect. So regions, I guess, in general, that see a lot of precipitation in a spatial dimensions also are associated with simulating quite a lot of calm stone vegetation. So wet areas tend to have more calm stone vegetation than dry areas. And when we look at the temperature in the second panel, we can see that hotter areas tend to have less vegetation carbon, but there's more differences between the CMIP 6 simulations and the offline simulations, which probably would need a bit more work to unpack why the temperature sensitivities are so different between these type of simulations, but it might just be the feedback. But the most important thing about this figure is actually the last two panels. So I'm just going to ignore the temporal effect of precipitation because we don't really have a lot of confidence and robustness in projections of precipitation for Australia. But we do know that pretty much every pixel of any scenario that is increasing CO2 also assimilates to increase in temperature. And what we found is when we statistically try to isolate the effect of temperature, it is also negative. So increasing temperature tends to decrease the calm stone vegetation, but the values are relatively low, with around -2.5, I guess, on median. And if you look at the temporal effect of CO2, it is positive, which is also what we saw in the dynamic simulation that I showed before. And the magnitude is a bit higher than that of temperature. Anyway, so now I'm running out of time. I'm just going to go to the conclusions. Obviously, when we apply bias correction to the climate projections before running it through LPJS, reduce the uncertainty quite significantly. And we do have a remaining uncertainty that is probably linked to things like not being able to correct the variability. So we still have different variability in the climate projections, and there's also, just different sensitivities to the combined effect of CO2 concentration, temperature, and precipitation in general, and these kind of models. And my last point, and that's the most important one, is I showed in two different ways that the atmospheric CO2 concentration dominates the signal of carbon storm vegetation increasing over time. But this is actually not really so sure whether this is a very robust result or not, because experimental, anecdotal results kind of show that we do think that productivity does increase with increasing CO2 fertilization, but the effect on the carbon storage actually is close to nothing. And we're also not really sure what the temperature sensitivity is. So there might actually be the magnitude and the sensitivity to temperature and CO2 might be a little off. And if it just shifted a little bit, we might see that carbon storm vegetation might actually be constant or decrease over time until the end of the century. And this needs more model development and more understanding in the process representation. And with that, I'll leave it here, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Lina. That was great. Do we have any questions for Lina? If you want to put your hands up or write in the chat. Just while people are having a think. Lina, where do you think the kind of model development should be focused to really target these uncertainties that you've found?
I think at the moment it would be really interesting to understand more how the CO2 effect actually works on the fluxes and also on the carbon storage. So there's these phase experiments, for example, that produce a lot of data that, as I said, in Australia, for example, showed that productivity increases, but the carbon storage doesn't seem to benefit it a whole lot. And there's also been new papers where they actually tuned their models to these phase experiments, and they found that in general, after tuning them to phase experiments, the productivity in the carbon storage is also lower, rather than when it's tuned to the FluxNet data. So where fluxes are just measured in natural environments. And I think this is still really early days, but it would be quite interesting to put more efforts into this and actually understand the effect of CO2 fertilization more. And also to understand more how resilient vegetation actually is to temperature, because I'm a bit doubtful that you can get increases or continuing increases in the center of Australia in vegetation carbon when temperature can increase to 50 degrees or something in really extreme models, and they still heavily increase because the CO2 fertilization is so strong. So I think a combined approach of understanding better how the temperature and CO2 sensitivities work in real life will really help understanding where the vegetation carbon is going in the future.
So you'd be concerned that some of the vegetation would have somewhat of a kind of tipping point where it just dies off or is unable to kind of function.
Yeah, well, Australia is really extreme in the way that it's really hot and has a lot of desert. So this is just for Australia, but I think in general, vegetation simulated is often really resilient to drought and temperature stress. And I don't know, I just find it probably needs more research and more support to actually show you that this is actually happening.
Great, thanks very much.